Welcome to the critical reasoning part, one of the most exciting sections of the verbal part. We'll start by analyzing the question format. As you can see, you have a paragraph that will either contain an argument, a plan of action, or a set of facts. We call that part the stimulus, and you need to analyze the stimulus in order to answer the question. Then you have a question and 5 answer choices. And what is this all about? Well, critical reasoning measures several skills. The most important one is your ability to think critically based only on the information given. Also, it measures your ability to make an argument, evaluate an argument, and formulate a plan of action. They may ask you to support a conclusion, weaken an argument, or maybe to find an assumption, or infer something based on premises. Sometimes they will ask you to evaluate a plan, or resolve a paradox, or identify the argument structure, or many other things. Whatever happens, you will have 9 to 11 questions in a regular verbal exam. So, what is an argument? What is a plan of action? What is a set of facts? Let's begin with the most important one, the argument. An argument is a premise that leads to a conclusion. The premise is evidence that supports the conclusion. And most of the time it is factual information. But every now and then, the premise will be a claim. On the other hand, a conclusion is almost always a claim, or a position, a belief. It's something subjective. So, whenever you have a premise and a conclusion, there is always an assumption. And the assumption is an unstated premise that is necessary for the conclusion to hold true. Let's take a look at the real GMAT argument. Here, for example, you have that wood smoke contains dangerous toxins that cause changes in human cells. Therefore, legislation is needed to regulate the use of open-air fires and wood-burning stoves. So notice that the first sentence is the premise, is factual information. And the second sentence is the conclusion, which is usually signaled by a keyword such as therefore, thus, hence, etc. Legislation is needed is a very strong position. And what do you think are possible assumptions here? What connects the premise with the conclusion? Well, one assumption, for instance, could be that the legislation is going to work, or that the legislation can actually be regulated. So notice that the assumption is something that supports the conclusion as well. Now sometimes you will have a plan of action, a plan and its objective. And usually the objective is signaled by an infinitive of purpose. In this particular example, we have that to continue these positive financial trends, the company planned to replace an old plant by a plant with triple the capacity of its largest plant. You have the objective and then the plan to achieve it. Those are very simple to understand. Finally, you may have a set of facts. You will usually see a couple of facts. Sometimes we'll see only one. Sometimes we'll see up to 4 facts. Each fact will be a sentence. And an example of a fact is something like this. 10 years ago, the number of taxpayers in Greenspace County was slightly greater than the number of registered voters. That's factual information. It is statistical evidence. So, the first step is to identify whether your stimulus contains an argument, a plan, or a set of facts. So, how do you identify a premise? How do you identify a conclusion in an argument? Remember that arguments are the most common stimulus. And usually you have a premise signal such as cause, example, or addition. The most important cause signals are because, since, as, due to, for the reason that, owing to, in that, and there are many others. Then you have example signal words such as for example, for instance, and such as. You may also have addition words such as furthermore, moreover, besides, in addition, also, and others. Notice that all of them have something in common. They provide additional evidence or an explanation. They support a conclusion. And how do you identify a conclusion? Well, most of the time they're very easy to see, but you will see certain consequence or result keywords such as therefore, thus, hence, so, consequently, for this reason, as a result, clearly, conclude that, it follows that, or the auxiliary should. That's a very strong opinion word. And identifying the premise and the conclusion is usually the most important step in an argument. So, what about the question types? There are many question types, and the most important ones are weaken and support, which, as you can see on the graph, represent more than 50%. Then you have other types such as assumption, inference, paradox, evaluate, bold statements, and flaw questions. There are some minor types that are not relevant and that haven't appeared in a long time. So we will focus only on these 8 types. Now, if you're in a rush, make sure you really understand weaken, support, assumption, and inference. Those 4 represent a bit more than 75%, almost 80% of the total. Then you can focus on the minor types such as paradox, evaluate, bold statement, and flaw. So, the general strategy to attack any critical reasoning question begins with reading the question to know what type it is. Is it weaken? Is it support? Is it assumption? What is it? Then you will analyze the stimulus. And remember that the stimulus may contain an argument, a plan, or a set of facts. If you're facing an argument, which is the most common, make sure you are able to connect the premise with the conclusion. If you are in front of a plan, make sure you understand the goal or the objective. Now, if you have a set of facts, make sure you are able to connect those facts as well. It is very important to identify the variables involved either in the premise, conclusion, plan, objective, or the variables in the facts, because most right answers will use those variables. So you have to make a prediction afterwards, and your prediction will be directly related with either the conclusion, the plan, or the facts. Now, you don't have to predict the exact answer, but you need to know what the answer should do, or you can say the direction of the answer. So, for example, if you have a weaken the conclusion question, and the conclusion is that if you eat too much, you gain weight, what is the direction of the answer? Well, the answer has to tell me that eating too much does not make me gain weight. And that's as far as you go. Make sure you understand what the answer must do. Finally, you will eliminate irrelevant information or opposite direction answers. Most irrelevant information is out of scope. It is not related with the variables in the premise, conclusion, or plan objective. Or sometimes you can have right answers that use different variables, but those variables will be directly related with the variables from the stimulus. And finally, how long do you have to answer a critical reasoning question? Well, ideally, you should take about 2 minutes. You have about 1 minute to understand the stimulus, do the analysis, and then you have 1 minute to analyze the answer choices. That's a total of 2 minutes. Of course, with some easy questions you can take maybe a minute and a half. With some more challenging questions you may take 2 minutes and a half, but the average is roughly 2 minutes. In the following lessons, we will analyze each question type, beginning with assumptions, then we'll go over support, weaken, inference, then evaluate, paradox, boldface, and flaw. In each of those lessons, we will learn about very specific strategies to attack each question type. So I hope you learned something, and have a wonderful day. I'll see you in the next lesson. Have fun. Bye.